In this video, we are going to write a new function completely from scratch. This is admittedly not a terribly useful function. It's not going to be a function that you're going to use in practical data analysis or simulations or whatever you're doing in Matlab. However, it's going to be a really great exercise that will help give you more experience writing functions and thinking about how to organize code and functions. And more importantly, I'm going to show you the reserved keywords nargin and varargin. These are two really important keywords to know when you are working with and programming your own functions. So here's the goal of our function. The goal of the function is to take some number of inputs. It can be 0 inputs, 1 input, or 2 inputs. And we want to do, so the first optional input is going to be a number that specifies the number of numbers to generate, random numbers to generate, and then sort them. So, and then the default value, if no input is given, the default value is 30, which means the function should generate 30 random numbers and then sort them. The second optional input, so we don't actually need to provide either of these inputs, but the second input, which is optional, is a plot toggle. So the default value is false, which means no plot is generated. And if this is set to true, then it generates a plot. The function will produce a plot that plots all of the sorted random numbers. And finally, the function can give an output, which is the sorted random numbers that was created in this step. Okay, now I'm going to walk you through writing out this function, including the help file and the input checks and so on. If at any point in the video you think that you know enough, you are comfortable enough to work ahead of me, then please pause the video and write some code and then come back to the video when you finished or when you are having a hard time figuring something out. Okay, so now we are basically starting from scratch. I wrote in a few comments here, but this is just, actually, these aren't even real comments. This is just a set of instructions for us. So it can be pretty intimidating to look at a blank MATLAB file. So let's start by writing down the key sections. So the key section is, first of all, we need to define the function. And let's see, function outvec equals, I'm going to call this function plot random because that's basically what it's doing. And now previously I have shown you to put inputs into parentheses after the function name. So that would go here. So you can do n, and let's call this other one plot toggle. Now that's fine for now. In a little bit later in this video, I'm actually going to change this to a keyword called varargin, which is a variable number of arguments inputted into the function. But this is okay for now. And then we need a function description. And I'm going to get back to this in a moment. First, I want to write out some top level comments. So the next section that we are going to need to do is do some input checks. So input checks. And in particular, we need to determine whether any inputs have been provided. So let's call this set default values if none inputted. So that is to say, if the user provides 0 inputs, then we need to say if there's no inputs provided, then we set n to be 30 and plot toggle to be false. And if there's only a first input provided, then we set n to be the first input and the plot toggle to be false. Okay. So then we need to check that n is numeric and a single number. So you would call this a scalar in the parlance of linear algebra. So we want the first input should be a number and it should be just one number, not a vector, for example. And then, I didn't actually specify this here, but let's say n, just to make this a little more interesting, let's say n must be between, how about 5 and 100? Okay, so then we're going to need another input check that says n must be between, and we can also make this inclusive, between 5 and 100. Okay, so those are all the input checks that I'm going to worry about here. And then we have another section where we will need to generate our random numbers. So generate random numbers and sort. And then a final section will be to generate a plot if requested. Okay, so again, like when we wrote that other function, basic stats, I haven't yet written a single line of code. All I've done is provide some top level overarching organization, and that's going to help me start thinking about how to work with this function. Okay, I also haven't saved this yet. This is still called untitled. So I'm going to save, and let's call this plot random. Okay, and actually you notice by default, because I wrote the function and then the function name, by default MATLAB offered to save, or suggested to save the name of the file corresponding to the name of the function, which is a good idea. Okay, so now we're going to start fleshing this thing out a little bit. I would like to start by writing a detailed help file. That's going to help me make sure that I understand how this function should work. So we start by writing plot random in all caps, and then this is going to be a function that generates and plots random, I'll say sorted random numbers. When you type help and then the name of a function in MATLAB, you will often find this, that the first line of the help file is the function name in all caps and a very brief description of what that function does. Okay, and then a slightly larger description, so it's going to be outvec equals plot random n and plot toggle. So let's see, now we have the inputs. So the inputs to the function are n, and that is the number of numbers to generate. Let's see, must be, I'll say this, must be in range 5 to 100. And I'm going to get rid of that forced space there. Okay, and then we have another input, which is, actually no, we need to write a little bit more here, don't we? So I'm going to say, actually maybe I'll put this on this line just to make it look a little nicer. Must be in range 5 to 100, and default value is 30. Okay, so that's the first input. And then we have the second input, which is plot toggle, and I'll do a little bit of spacing here. Okay, so then the plot toggle is 0 for no plot, and this is the default value, and anything else for a plot. All right, and then we have the outputs. So the outputs, it's actually just one. The output is called outvec, and that is the sorted random number vector. All right, and then I'm going to put my name or my website here, mikexcohen.com. Okay, so save this, and now just to make sure that this already is working here, I'm going to type help plot random, just to make sure that we get this friendly little help message. Okay, so that's going to help me, that helps guide me to know what the inputs should be and how to work with them. So the next section here is the input checks. However, I like to save the input checks for later on. I'm going to jump right into this part. So for now, as I'm writing the code, I am assuming that the user is going to provide inputs exactly how I want them to be specified. Now, I've mentioned before that is probably not such a great assumption in many cases, but for now, I'm the only user, and I'm going to write in these input checks a little bit later. Okay, so we want to generate some random numbers. Let's call this variable vec equals rand n, and this has to be n random numbers, and n here is the first input into the function up here. Now these need to be sorted, so I'm going to use the function. There's a function sort. I haven't yet introduced you to this function, but it's a function sort. Let's see, let's start with, I'll set n equals 10. And so this is going to generate 10 numbers, random numbers, drawn from a normal or Gaussian distribution. And then I'm going to use the function sort, so outvec equals sort vec. So sort is simply going to sort these numbers. So we can see that now we have this variable, outvec, and that contains the sorted numbers. They start from the smallest or the most negative to the largest or most positive. You can also, if you want to sort the other way, you can provide an optional second input into the sort function, and that will be descend. So now this vector is sorted descending. It starts at the largest positive value and it goes to the most negative value. Okay, and I didn't actually specify in the instructions whether it needs to be sorted up or down. So, I will let you figure out what you like. All right, so that's actually all we need to do in this section. This section is complete. So now we have generate a plot if requested. So let's open up a new figure, and I'm going to force this to be figure 100, just for no other reason than I know how to do that. So let's see, let's call up a new figure, and then we want to plot the data, and I'm going to write plot, and then we want to plot the out vec, and maybe I'll make this black square with a line connecting them. And I want a slightly thicker line width than the default. And I'm going to set the marker face color to be white. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. So this is going to be, actually, let me show you, let me just do it like this for now, just so you see what this part of the code looks like. So you can see, well, you can't really see it. Okay, I'm going to change the marker size. So marker size, let's set this to, how about 16? So now I've made the markers bigger. So the marker is actually just a black line around the square here. It's invisible in the inside, so you can see right through it. You see the line going through it. But I think it would be nicer if it looked like a box that was sitting on top of the line. And that's why I'm going to add the marker face color. So the face is the inside part of the marker. So I'm going to set the marker face color to be white. And now that looks like this. I think that looks a little bit nicer. And of course, I encourage you to play around with the colors. You can set the marker face color to be yellow if you like, and so on. Let's see. And then I would like to add a little bit of aesthetics to this plot. So I'm going to write an X label. And well, this is an arbitrary axis. It's not really meaningful. It's not space or time. It just is what it is. So I'm going to call this the X axis. And then I suppose that means we should call the Y label Y axis. And what should we make for a title? Well, we can just say the plot. It seems pretty descriptive to me. Okay, so let me run all of this code, make sure that looks good. Now, this is all fine. I don't really like that this marker is exactly on the y-axis here, and this marker is also exactly on this axis boundary. So I am going to change that. I'm going to set get current axis. I'm going to change the x limit. This starts at 1. This is basically, this plot is always going to start at 1. So I'm going to set the lower bound of the x-axis limit to be 0. So it's going to go so that, then this dot will actually be over here. And what should the upper bound be? Well, we need this to be flexible for whatever n is set to. So we could set it to be n like this. However, that's not really, now this looks even worse because this is asymmetric. So in fact, we want this to be n plus 1. So regardless of what n is, it ends up being a little bit to the outside. Now, in my opinion, that's a little bit too much blank space on here in these margins. I think I'm going to try 0.5. So 0.5 to n plus 0.5. And I think that looks nicer. I'm pretty happy with how this plot looks, particularly the title. I really like this title. All right, so now we've written some code. What I would like to do is, so I'm going to save this file, of course, and I want to try running this code and see, we're not finished the function, of course, but I want to try running it to see if it's working so far. So I'm going to type plot random, and then let's go for, how about 32 numbers. All right, so that looks pretty cool. This is sorted random numbers, and we get the plot, and the output is, although I didn't assign this to a variable, we still get the output, and that's the sorted random numbers. Now, the first thing that I want to fix, or the next thing that I want to add to this, is a plot toggle because it's actually supposed to be the case that we get to decide whether to include the plot or not. And here, with this code, the plot is always going to show up. So what I'm going to do is use an if-then statement. So I'm going to say if plot toggle. Now, if this is true, then this gets implemented. And if it's false, if the plot toggle is set to false, then nothing happens. There's no alternative statements here. So nothing happens, which means we don't get a plot. So let's see. I will close these figures here and run this code again. And okay, so now this says not enough input arguments. That's pretty interesting because we just ran it before and it was fine. Here it says not enough input arguments. And what's happening here is that previously the variable plot toggle was never being used inside the function. So Matlab didn't care that we weren't specifying or weren't inputting this variable. But here it says not enough input arguments. Okay, so let's try this again. I'm going to set this to be, let's start with setting this to be false. And great, we get nothing. So I used a semicolon, so we suppress the output, and we don't get a plot. So let's try again. Now I'm going to set this to be true, and we do get a plot and random numbers. Okay, so this is starting to look pretty good, but we still have the input checks to do, of course. But I was very clear when I gave the instructions that the function should take optional input. So we want the function to work with only providing one input or 0 inputs. So how can we do that here? Well, the way that we do that is by replacing these two explicit inputs with one variable, and that's called var arg in. So again, this stands for variable arguments into the function. And now I'm going to step into the function here, and that's going to allow us to basically look inside this function and see what Matlab does with this var arg in business here. So run this function again, and it steps in right here because that's where I put the button. And now I'm going to type whose. Now nothing has been run in this function yet, so all we have is this variable here, var arg in. Notice it is a 2-element cell. It's a cell array. So let's see what this looks like. It's a cell array, so the first cell is 32, and the next cell is 1, and this is actually a Boolean. This is actually true. And that corresponds to the two inputs that I have provided. So that's pretty neat. So let me break out, oops, no, I want to keep that breakpoint there. So I'm going to type db quit. I'm going to run this again with only one input. And then we see what var arg in is. Oops, yeah. And now it's just a one cell array, so it's just one element, and that is the one input that we've provided. So how do we know how many inputs the user has inputted? Well, you could do something like, num_l or length var arg in. That works. But there's another keyword that Matlab gives us access to, and that is n arg in. And here that's 1 because there was one argument in, so n arg in equals 1. And that is the key to figuring out how to set the default values if none or fewer than instructed are inputted. Now, if you've been following along so far and you're pretty motivated now, I encourage you to pause the video and see if you can figure out this part of the code using n arg in and var arg in. Okay, so what we need to do is say something like if, and so there's several possibilities. Well, there's 3 possibilities. The number of arguments in is 0, else if the number of arguments in is 1, else if the number of arguments in is 2, and I'm going to say actually greater than 1. Okay, so these are our possibilities. So what do we do if n arg in equals 0? Then we need to set n to be the default value of 30, and we need to set the plot toggle to be the default value of false. Okay, and now before continuing on to the rest of these statements, I want to quit out of this function, and I'm going to do that just by saving it. And then I'm going to test this with 0 inputs. So let's see, I'm going to do plot random with no inputs whatsoever, just like this. And okay, I need an output here. So, and then we get this output, so these sorted random numbers, and we don't get a plot. So that is what we expected here. In fact, just to make sure that this code is working, I'm going to change the default plot toggle to be true and run this code again, and indeed we get a plot. Okay, and now if we provide one input, let's see what happens if we give one input of 31. Aha, so we get an error message, and now it says unrecognized function or variable n, and the error comes from line 41. That's because we haven't defined n yet. Look, n is not defined anywhere except for here, but this statement only gets run when n arg in equals 0. And in fact, n arg in here equals 1. So how can we, what's the right thing to do here? I'm going to put another break mark over here. And now we get in here. So this conditional is false because n arg in is 1. So this conditional is true. And now we need to figure out how to get the n out of var arg in. Well, this one is pretty straightforward. We say n equals var arg in, and then we want the first input. But we haven't provided a second input, so we still need to set the plot toggle to be its default value, which is false. Okay, and then if we provide both inputs, then this is arg in 1, and then var arg in 2 is the plot toggle, just like this. Okay, so now we have our three cases. If the user provides no inputs, then we set n and plot toggle to be the default values. If there's one input, we set n to be the first input and the plot toggle to be false, the default value. And if there is two inputs given, then n and plot toggle are the first two inputs. Now, you can imagine all sorts of weird things that the user might do, or maybe not weird things, but you might want to allow the function to be flexible enough so that if the user does something like this, provides an empty input, then it will take the default value for this empty input and this actual inputted value to be the plot toggle. Now, a situation like this actually comes up reasonably often in code. Many functions should be flexible enough to deal with a situation like this. This particular piece of code is actually not capable of dealing with this situation here. However, so I'm not going to program that in now because the video is already starting to get a bit long, but I am confident that you can adjust this code for this kind of situation where the first input is empty, so it should be the default value, and the second input is whatever the user specifies. All right, so let me get through these other input checks here. So the first input should be numeric, and it should be a single number. So I'm going to use the function isNumeric. I've already introduced you to this function. Or if the function, so if the length of n is greater than 1. So now these are problematic cases. If this happens, or if this happens, then we want to produce an error message, and I'm going to write help plot random, and then the error message should be a helpful message. So let's say first input needs to be one number. All right. So that is this input check, and then we have this input check that the first input, so n, must be between 5 and 100. So here I will write if n is less than 5, or if n is greater than 100, then essentially we copy and paste this. So we send out a help message and a helpful error message. So then the first input needs to be between 5 and 100. All right, and this is a complete English sentence, so I'll end it with a period like this. All right, so I am pretty happy with what we've accomplished in this video and what you've learned. So I gave you a review, a reminder that when you start off writing a new script or a new function, the first thing you do is start with the high-level comments and the large-scale structure organization of the code. You don't start immediately by writing code, you start immediately by writing comments. And then once you have enough comments, then you start writing code. I tend to do the input checks last, but that's just my preference. And in this video, I also introduced you to these really important keywords for working with functions, n-argin and var-argin. In the next video, we are going to create another function, and that one's actually going to be a really useful function. I believe that the function we create in the next video is a function that you will use in your actual day-to-day MATLAB interactions. Stay tuned.